Good afternoon and welcome to this presentation on the Climate Change Authority's Targets and Progress Review Final Report. My name is Anthea Harris. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Climate Change Authority. I'm going to give a short presentation on the key findings and recommendations on our report, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions towards the end. You can submit questions at any time through this webinar. Firstly, a little bit about us. The Climate Change Authority is an independent statutory authority, and our job is to provide evidence-based advice to the government about climate change policies. Bernie Fraser is our chair, and we have 8 other members with a broad range of expertise covering climate change science, economics, business and public policy. Our reviews are all legislated and they're guided by legislated principles, which boil down to economic efficiency, environmental effectiveness and equity. And we operate in a very transparent way, and we're obliged to consult with the public on all of our reviews. So this particular review, the Targets and Progress Review, is all about what Australia's emissions reduction goals should be and how we're progressing towards those goals. It's particularly timely for 2 main reasons. First of all, Australia has an opportunity in 2014 to be reviewing its 2020 target. So at the moment, Australia has a minimum target on the table, and 2014 is its opportunity to say whether it's sticking with that or increasing that target. And next year, Australia will be expected to put forward its post-2020 goals. Also on the domestic front, currently the government is formulating details of its new policy, new climate change policy known as the Direct Action Policy. And so the work that we have done, we hope will be useful for that process, because it identifies where we have made progress in reducing emissions to date and where there are opportunities for further reductions. For example, in light vehicles, perhaps a role for standards, and the continued deployment of renewables, and we can find other cost-effective ways of achieving stronger targets, for example, through the use of international emissions reductions, which we'll talk more about later in this presentation. In making our recommendations, we've looked at the latest in climate change science, which really forms the backdrop and the fundamental understandings for all the work that we do. We look very carefully at global action, what other countries are doing. We of course know that Australia can't solve the problems of climate change all by itself. We look at equity, and this on a number of dimensions between countries and between generations, and also we look very carefully at what the economic implications would be of the recommendations that we make. We've consulted extensively throughout this review. We've received over 12,000 written submissions. We've held a number of expert workshops and stakeholder roundtables. We've made presentations to interested groups and state and territory governments. The authority work is grounded in the fact that it's in Australia's strong national interest to be part of international efforts to reduce the risks of climate change. We know that human activities are causing the climate to warm, and climate change poses a major risk for Australia's people in relation to health issues, for our economy, particularly in relation to agriculture, agricultural productivity, the situation of our cities and our infrastructure by the coast, and for our environment. So degradation of coral reefs, species extinction as some of the examples there. Global action to avoid the worst impacts of climate change will benefit Australia. It is in our strong interest to be encouraging others to take strong action on climate change, and Australia should play its part in that action. So what are we recommending? We're recommending a set of goals for Australia to take action on climate change. For the short term, we're recommending a minimum target of 15% plus an extra 4%, which is really credit that we've got from past action called carryover. For the medium term, we're recommending a target range, a trajectory range of between 40 to 60% compared with 2000 levels by 2030. And for the long term, we're recommending that Australia's emissions stays within a budget of 10.1 gigatons, so 10.1 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in the period between 2013 and 2050. Just to give you a picture of what those goals might look like, all of that yellow triangle that we've illustrated there is what we propose as a long-term national budget. That hashed area of the triangle is the how much of that budget we propose to use up between now and 2020 if our emissions reduction recommendations are adopted. You can see that trajectory range going out to 2030. The middle of that range, so between 40 and 60%, the middle of that range is a 50% reduction by 2030. That would be using up our proposed long-term budget in a straight line fashion. You can see that the bottom of that target range, so the 40% number, means that we're using up less of that budget, potentially saving more for later, or potentially opting for a tighter budget altogether. The top of that target range really isn't consistent with that budget. So that's really a situation you'd go to the top of that budget, that target range, if you've decided that that budget is no longer appropriate for Australia. In relation to the 2020 targets, the authority considers that this is consistent with the science and it's fair to future generations. If we stick with our minimum commitment of a 5% target, it risks a costly and disruptive adjustment in the future. It leaves too much of the effort to later. We also know that a target of 15 plus 4 is in line with the efforts of similar countries, including the United States. So if we look at the countries that we normally like to compare ourselves with, we can see that keeping with this minimum target of a 5% target does not keep up with the scale and pace of international action. And we know that from an economic perspective, a target of 15 plus 4 can be achieved while the economy and national incomes continue to grow. Looking at this issue of how quickly we use up this proposed long-term national budget, this chart illustrates that your decisions about where you go to 2020 and 2030 have great implications for how quickly you would need to reduce emissions later. You can see the red line relates to the minimum 5% target. You can see that, of course, the less you do later, the more quickly that budget is exhausted, and it entails extraordinarily steep and rapid reductions at later times. So the more you do in the short term, the more of that budget you have later, and the less rapidly that you need to reduce emissions in coming decades. Of course, we know that Australia can't solve this problem alone. We have looked at a broad range of international action. We've also looked very carefully at what China and the US are doing, because we know from the basis of the arithmetic of climate change, we need those two very large emitters, which together account for at least 37% of global emissions. We need those countries to be taking this issue seriously. And the good news is that there is growing evidence that that is the case. So they are both stepping up their efforts on climate change, and we can see that in evidence, not only by the targets that they have on the table, which are significant, but also their actions on the ground. So, for example, huge investments in renewable energy in both of these countries. We can see very strong vehicle emission standards in both of those countries. They have much stronger requirements than we have here in Australia. In fact, technically, we have no standards here in Australia that are mandatory at all. We can also see subnational emissions trading schemes in both of those countries in operation and under development. Both of those countries are also now turning their mind to what they might be doing after 2020. In our report, we go through the commitments of a range of other countries, and we've looked at it very explicitly across a number of dimensions. And this is a chart that's reproduced from our report, and I encourage you to have a look at the more detailed analysis here. We've looked at it from a number of perspectives, so absolute emissions reductions, changes in emissions intensity of your whole economy, reductions from business as usual emissions, and what it means for per person emissions. All of these ways of looking at things are all relevant and important. And so we've done a very transparent analysis of this, and we can see where Australia's different targets might line up against what other countries are doing. And you can see the red dots there are, if we stick with our minimum commitment of -5, it does look weak compared with what other countries are doing, particularly wealthy advanced economies such as ourselves. As I said at the start of this presentation, we've looked very carefully at what the economic costs might be of pursuing stronger targets. Now, this chart shows our estimated impacts on gross national income per capita from 2013 to 2020 going from the minimum 5% commitment, stepping up to that stronger commitment of 19%, which is that minimum 15% commitment plus the 4% of carryover. And you can see that the impact on the growth rate of gross national income per capita is very small. In both those scenarios, incomes are estimated to still continue to rise, and that there's only a 0.02% change in the annual growth rate between 2013 and 2020. And in fact, that gap in where gross national income per person would be in 2020 would actually be made up in 3 months' time. Turning now to the medium term, so for 2030 goals, wide range of stakeholders across the spectrum really supported the authority making recommendations about life beyond 2020. The trajectory range that we have proposed of 40 to 60% provides some flexibility for Australia to adjust its action. It's probably too early right now to be able to pinpoint exactly where Australia's emissions should be targeting for 2030, but we can have some flexibility to take into account changing circumstances. In particular, the authority recommends that longer term goals always be reviewed in the light of developments in climate science, the level of international action and economic factors. We recommend that both the trajectory ranges and the long-term emissions budget be regularly reviewed according to those criteria. All of our recommendations are set out in the context of a proposed long-term national budget for greenhouse gas emissions. The idea of this budget is to set an overall limit on emissions. Once you start thinking about this long-term global budget, it really highlights the trade-offs between short-term action and longer-term action. You can start thinking about how quickly you want to use up that budget and what it implies for future decades and future generations for Australia. In terms of how we've calculated this budget, first of all, to get to a budget from Australia, we've started from a global emissions budget that provides a likely chance of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees. This is an internationally agreed goal to try and avoid the very worst impacts of climate change. The authority considers that Australia's fair share of that global budget is 10.1 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Just to put that in perspective, that's around 17 years of emissions at current levels. The authority considers its 2020 recommended target to be the minimum reduction consistent with staying within that budget, and having a weaker target than that recommended target would leave too much effort for later. The second part of our review talks about what kind of progress we have made already towards our emissions reduction goals. This chart highlights from from the perspective of the overall economy, what's been going on since the year 2000. Now, you can see that we've broken this down because, of course, there are lots of things going on in the economy which will affect overall emissions. On the very right-hand side, we've got the net impact, so what actually happened to emissions, and that is they went up between 2000 and 2011. But we've broken that down. So on the very left-hand side, we can see that economic activity generally pushed emissions up. So it's a period of strong economic growth which tends to cause emissions to increase. On the other hand, the next bar shows that particularly in earlier years, shifts in our economic structure help push emissions down. There was a tendency to move away from very emissions intensive processes towards less emissions activities such as services, for example. So that tended to have over the period a dampening impact on emissions. We can also see that emissions reductions activity, so this is actual reductions in the emissions intensity of doing the same thing, that actually made a significant contribution towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's quite a lot of breakdown across sectors in our report. We also identify many opportunities across all sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And some of those opportunities relate to energy efficiency across the spectrum in our industry, our homes and our businesses, and using more efficient transport. We can also see significant opportunities to transition towards lower emissions intensity electricity generation. In fact, of all the sectors that we analyse, we see some of the greatest potential in the electricity sector. Adopting low emissions technologies and production processes in a range of industries, and on the land sector, continuing to reduce land clearing, increase forest cover and improve land and forest management. While we can see those opportunities, we will need effective policies to actually elicit those opportunities in the real world. And given the time taken to develop, implement policies and then for them to have some effect, if we want longer term change, we actually need to be thinking about those policies now. Some of the challenges that we see, if there were no additional policies, so without a direct action plan, without a carbon price, our estimate is that in 2020 emissions would be 17% above 2000 level emissions. Looking at very strong incentives or a very high carbon price as it has been modelled, we could see emissions being as low as 6% below 2000 levels. There's a good deal in the report about the need for Australia to remain competitive in a future low emissions world. We do see that gradually transforming our economy to put it on a lower emissions footing would be in our long-term economic interests. For the shorter term in particular, we do see a role for drawing on international emissions reductions to help meet the targets that we have recommended. So we see a mixture of domestic and international emissions reductions contributing to those 2020 goals. Genuine international emissions reductions can meet the recommended target in a cost-effective way. This is a good time to be drawing on these particular types of units. There are high-quality units available at historically low prices at the moment. We recommend that the government could establish a fund to purchase these international units, which could help bridge the gap between domestic reductions and the recommended target. Now, just going from -5 to -19, so the 15 plus 4, it's estimated that this fund would need between $210 million and $850 million between now and 2020. And this is based on unit prices of between 50 cents and $2 a tonne, recognising that current prices are well below $1 currently. In terms of what the job that we see for international emissions reductions, here is the picture of our projected emissions, that blue line going to 17% above 2000 levels by 2020. That yellow triangle is the gap between where we see a kind of a business as usual projection and the -5. So you can see a significant gap there of 593 megatons. There may be a role even within that for international emissions reductions to play some role in contributing to meeting that gap. But in particular, this gap between -5 and -19, we do see that as being a role for international emissions reduction. So that's getting to that stronger target would be a very good using international emission reductions would be a very good way to achieve that target. So in summary, the science is clear. The world urgently needs to cut greenhouse gas emissions. We know that Australia would benefit from global action, and so we need to play our part. We need to strengthen our efforts now, otherwise we leave future generations with an improbably large task. The responsible course of action is to raise our 2020 target to at least 15%. We can boost this to 19% by taking advantage of actions that we've already taken. And the target is achievable if strong policies are implemented now, the costs are small and they can be managed. Thank you. Okay, I have one question here that the EU is already committed to a 20% reduction by 2020 from its 1990 levels. Why should Australia commit to only a 19% reduction, given that Australia's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are about twice EU levels? So, in relation to our comparisons with the EU, first of all, I'd like to say that all of our recommendations are put in the perspective of trying to balance up where we are now to where we go in the future, all nested in what we think is a reasonable long-term budget for Australia. So, The recommendations that we have made, we think are achievable given where we are right now, but still calibrated to make those long-term emission reductions, staying within our long-term budget, achievable. So in the authority's view, this balances up all of those different parameters, and this is something that is achievable as well as being responsible for Australia. I have another question here, is that what are the implications for Australia in international climate negotiations if the government does not accept the CCA's recommendations for a stronger target and participation in the international carbon market? Well, it's difficult to say what exactly the implications would be. What we can say is that it would certainly help in our international negotiations if Australia took on a stronger target. We know that our chief objective should be trying to encourage other countries to take stronger actions. It's very difficult to ask other countries and point the finger and ask other countries to do more if you're not being seen to be taking strong action yourselves. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We have very high emissions per capita. It's very difficult to make a case to others to do a lot if we can't be seen to be taking stronger action ourselves. It will be noticed what we do. It wasn't a surprise to us when our draft report came in that our first submission that we received was from South Africa. The rest of the world does what Australia does. If all carbon dioxide emissions were stopped today, it could take up to 1,000 years to see a reduction in temperature. Given this, why is there a rush to reduce greenhouse gas emissions now? Well, I think the answer to that question is thinking back to the science and what causes temperatures to rise and what causes the risks that we face from climate change. Climate change is a stock problem. It's about how many greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere at any one time. It's exactly correct to say that it takes a long time for emissions to wash out of the system entirely, but given we know it's a stock problem, we can't solve it if we keep adding to the stock. The more that we add, the bigger the problem, the higher the concentration of greenhouse gases, the more heat the world absorbs. So we can't attempt to solve this problem without getting on top of the amounts of greenhouse gases that we're continuing to add to the atmosphere. The more quickly we can do that, then the lower the level of greenhouse gases will be in the atmosphere for the longer term. Okay, I've got a question here about without the purchase of international units, what can Australia achieve domestically, particularly in the electricity sector? Well, we can see that actually there's quite a bit that can be done in our own domestic electricity sector. So I point you to the modelling that we have done, and in particular on our website there's a separate modelling report in particular on the emissions in the electricity sector under a whole range of different scenarios. So I certainly encourage you to have a look at that. There's a couple of things that we can see being particular opportunities. For Australia, the continuing deployment of renewable energy in the shorter term out to 2020 seem like the major source of emissions reductions from that sector. On the demand side, we can also see significant opportunities for reducing greenhouse gases by reducing our demand for electricity. I've got another question here. Does the government have to do anything in response to this report? Our legislation requires that the government table our report within 15 sitting days of Parliament. We also, and the legislation also requires the government to respond to our recommendations. They have 6 months to respond to those recommendations. The government has already responded that they will look at consider our recommendations carefully. Achieving low carbon transformation in Australia will be important for future national competitiveness. Bearing this in mind, how should the nation balance the share of emissions reductions procured from overseas versus those achieved in Australia? This is really a question about what's the right balance between domestic effort and international effort, and it's difficult to come up with the perfect magic answer there. What we would point out though is that long-term transformation of our domestic economy is important. It's not something that we can put off forever. We wouldn't recommend not attempting any reductions in our own greenhouse gas emissions. However, we know, for example, particularly to 2020, that it's not very far away. We know even if we wanted to, we couldn't get very large domestic emissions reductions from our own economy. We've left our run a bit late. So we do think, though, that that shouldn't be an excuse really for Australia to make a smaller contribution to international emissions reduction efforts. We have these markets for international emissions reductions. That's what they're there for. They're there to allow countries like Australia to make a bigger contribution by drawing on cheaper emissions reductions from elsewhere. They also play an important role in developing countries as well. Through investments from richer countries like Australia, they can help put them on a lower emissions growth path. We have a question here: how would Australia's 15% target compare to the US's target? Now, very unhelpfully, countries have expressed their targets according to different base years. So we've always talked about our target being compared with our 2000 level emissions. The US has a target of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 17% compared with its 2005 level emissions. We talk about this in one of the appendices in our report. So the US will actually, if it meets its 17% target, it's actually going to be 20% below its 2000 level emissions in 2020. Putting it round the other way, if we were to be 17% below our 2005 level emissions, then that's the equivalent of being 10% below our 2000 level emissions. I hope that's clear. I point you to the direction of the appendix where we talk about that in our report. Another question here: what are the financial implications or economic costs if we don't take on board the CCA recommendations? Well, there's probably two things that are important here. In relation to, first of all, why are we doing any of this? It's because we need to make a contribution to international efforts on climate change. I'm not suggesting that we can solve the global problem ourselves, but we do need to play our part. And so if we give up on attempting to influence international efforts, or we failed to care, the implications would be that we don't care that actually there would be things going on in the climate system which have profound impacts for our society and our economy. So the cost to our economy of unabated climate change would be tremendous, and I would certainly refer you to the Garnaut review that was done a few years ago for much more information about that. Then there's the impact on our own competitiveness. If the rest of the world does continue to take action, we don't want to be stranded, essentially with the equivalent of a rust bucket economy based on very high emissions intensity that would not be competitive in a lower emissions intensity world. I've got a question here: if minus 15 is responsible, is minus 5 irresponsible? Well, the Climate Change Authority recommends minus 15 as a minimum. We do think that minus 5 puts too much effort onto the shoulders of future Australians. In fact, not even necessarily future Australians, us current Australians, if we intend to be around beyond 2020. The types of emissions reductions that would be required, if we're taking seriously the goal of actually playing our fair part in international efforts, would be very steep. We have a question here: isn't tripling of the target in just 6 years somewhat unrealistic? In the authority's view, no. We've got the gap between where we think business as usual emissions might be and the 5%. And you can see that was a gap in 2020 of being between 17% above 2000 levels and minus 5. So there's a 22 percentage point gap just to get to minus 5. Actually, to get from minus 5 to minus 19, which is that 15 plus 4, is only another 14 percentage point gap. And because we have access to international emissions units available at the moment at historically low prices, we consider this target is eminently achievable. Okay. this probably relates to this next question. Is your report saying that Australia could meet a target of 15% by buying international permits for $200 million? First of all, there's a few things to note here. This is about the incremental cost of getting from -5 to -19, so that 15 plus 4. And if you did all of that, as we recommend, by purchasing international emissions units, of course it depends on the price of those international units. We've done a range of costings, you know, if they were 50 cents up to if they were $2, and that works out to be you have to buy 427 million of them, so that works out to be between $210 million and $850 million between now and 2020. Has our review taken into account the nature of any post-2020 agreement? At this stage, we know some things, but there's still a lot of flesh to be put on the bones about what a post-2020 agreement might look like. We're not actually 100% sure of what the time frame will be for that agreement, whether when the commitments will be based around 2030 or some earlier time. That said, at the end of the day, we do know that we have strong engagement from a whole host of countries, importantly including China and the US. We do know that we will need to be able to put some sort of numbers on the table. So the recommendations that we're making now for beyond 2020, so from 40 to 60% reductions by 2030, are certainly relevant for thinking about what we're going to put on the table ourselves in 2015. There's a question here, how would we communicate a new target through the United Nations? There are a number of opportunities to do that, so there'll be through formal and less formal channels. There'll be opportunities earlier next year, but really all leading up to the conference in Paris in December in 2015. Okay, we have one final question. Do you consider that the price of international units to be very sensitive to the potential purchase of 400 million units? We've done quite a bit of analysis on this, and we've certainly spoken to a lot of people who are actively engaged in this market. And even though you'd think that going out and buying 400 million of anything might potentially have quite a significant impact on the price, actually, all the evidence that we have to date is that no, we don't think that Australia purchasing that many units would have any very significant impact on the price. In fact, most commentators didn't think it would have any noticeable impact at all. Okay, that's all that we have time for today. Thank you very much for your attendance. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us. And you can find on our website an inquiries line. So please feel free to email any further questions through to there. Thank you very much.